Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaea Viking. Today is the official 26th video and the unofficial 20th video in my series on the early imperial expansion of the United States. The subject of today's video is the Oregon Trail and the colonization of California and the Pacific Northwest by the United States. So, right off the bat, whenever we here in the United States, Canada, and Mexico hear the phrases such as the Pacific Northwest and California, we tend to think of, for example, the Pacific Northwest, the region that roughly includes the westernmost province of Canada, British Columbia, as well as U.S. states such as Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and occasionally, in the case of the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, Montana, Wyoming, and some maps also put Utah and Nevada there as well. And in the case of California, we tend to think of one of the three westernmost states in the United States. And these are not inaccurate views to have. After all, these regions have had their shapes. Um, and these states have had their shapes for roughly around 150 to 100, to maybe uh, at least 100 years ago, give or take. Um, However, this is not the full picture. These regions, California and the Pacific Northwest, only took on their shapes, their political boundaries, after a long series of events and catalysts. For example, prior to the colonization by European powers such as the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Russian Empire, and the French Empire, and the United States, uh, this region was inhabited by a diverse group of Native American cultures and nations, which you can see here as the Native American cultures and nations of the Pacific Northwest prior to contact with European powers. And here is a map of the Native American cultures and nations of California prior to contact with European imperial powers. So, in order to better understand how the Pacific Northwest and California took on the shapes that they have now, we need to go back a little bit further in time to get a better look at the larger picture. Now, that being said, there are a couple of um, caveats I need to make. First of all, the majority of this video will be focused on the colonization of the Pacific Northwest by the United States. The next video will look at the colonization of California by the United States in greater detail, but um, as the Oregon Trail, the trail that is most famous for being used to colonize the Pacific Northwest, was also used to colonize California as well as a few other states such as Wyoming and Nevada. It is important to touch on their part, the part that the Oregon Trail had in the colonization of these areas as well. And then the second caveat I want to make is that generally in the previous videos in this series, I have uh, ended the early period of U.S. imperial expansion at around 1848, 1850 CE-ish, 1848 CE, 1850 CE. However, the colonization, or at least the main periods of colonization of the Pacific Northwest and California started in 1848 CE and continued well into the 1860s and 70s. So, with that in mind, it's important that we cover the full breadth of these periods of colonization. So, therefore, the videos will cover from 1848 to the 1860s and 70s, both this video and the next video. Uh, and then furthermore, with that in mind, these last two videos will be both part of the series on early imperial United States expansion and will also be part of a later series on the intermediate period, or what I call the intermediate period of U.S. imperial expansion. All right, so with that out of the way, let us begin to go back and look at the bigger picture of how the Pacific Northwest and California took on the political shapes they have now. Starting with the early exploration of the Pacific Northwest by the United States and the British Empire. So, by the founding of the United States, the Pacific Northwest was a territory that was contested by the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, and the Russian Empire. And this was a period of time where this area was being disputed between uh, really before this, but if we're looking at the foundation of the United States, roughly between 1782 CE or 1789 CE, depending on whether you're looking at the Articles of Confederation, which is the nation that slightly preceded the United States, or the United States itself, up until 1804 CE, which is right around the time when Napoleon Bonaparte would sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase to pay for his and the French Empire's war effort in Haiti. And he would make the sale in 1803. And then between 1804 and 1806 CE, the United States would dispatch the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the Louisiana Purchase and the Pacific Northwest. However, after the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Pacific Northwest would remain disputed territory and would remain that way really past this period, but in the immediate 4 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition from 1806 to 1810 CE. Then, in between 1810 and 1812 CE, John Jacob Astor, yes, of the various hotels named Astoria, including the Waldorf Astoria in New York, would dispatch the Astoria expedition to the Pacific Northwest in an attempt to establish a colony for the United States in the region. However, the colonization would fail due to competition from the rival Northwest Company, as well as the destruction of the Tonk when the ship meant to resupply the colony, and the outbreak of the War of 1812 CE. And I've already done an in-depth video on both the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Astoria expedition, and I will include both videos in the iCard. With the departure of the Astoria expedition, the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company would continue to expand the fur trade into the Pacific Northwest from British Canada between 1812 and 1821 CE. And here's a depiction of a fur trading post with the most sought after furs and pelts being beaver pelts, which you can see an example of here. And you can see sort of a map of the expansion of fur trading into the Pacific Northwest. Again, starting with the Northwest Company, the Hudson Bay Company, and John Jacob Astor's Pacific Fur Company, which was really a subsidiary of the American Fur Company. Then, in 1818 CE, the United States and the British Empire would agree to jointly occupy the Pacific Northwest in what would become known as the Anglo-American Convention of 1818 CE. Then, between 1820 and 1823, the United States would dispatch Major Stephen Long to further explore the interior of North America. Long would then go on to refer to the North American Great Plains as, quote, unfit for human habitation and as, quote, the Great American Desert. In contrast, the Pacific Northwest would begin to look more appealing for colonization by the United States as the region had fertile lands, a disease-free climate, extensive forests, big rivers, potential for seaports, and only a few nominally British settlers. Meanwhile, in British Canada, after a series of violent confrontations between the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company, known as the Pemmican War, pemmican being a survival food uh, that was used heavily at the time, the Northwest Company would then be forced to merge with the Hudson Bay Company, with the Pemmican War lasting between 1812 and 1821 CE. After this merger, the Hudson Bay Company would go on to establish a network of trading posts such as Fort Vancouver in the Pacific Northwest, known as the York Factory Express, with this express being constructed and the forts that were part of this express being constructed between the 1820s and 1840s CE, where pelts would be taken and captured and processed at Fort Vancouver and then brought along and also traded with Native American nations along the route all the way back to the York factory in Hudson Bay. While the York Factory Express was being constructed by the Hudson Bay Company, the United States based Missouri Fur Company and the Rocky Mountain Fur Company would begin to explore and map the North American Great Plains and the Pacific Northwest. And they would do this between the 1820s and 1840s CE. Famous mountain men who would participate in these expeditions would include famous American mountain men who would participate in these expeditions, because that is important to point out, because obviously there were British mountain men that were part of the Hudson Bay Company. Famous American mountain men who would participate in these expeditions include the African American James Beckwourth, as well as many white Americans such as Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, uh, Hugh Glass, Kit Carson, and Peter Skeen Ogden. And here is a picture and map of the routes used by Jedediah Smith. And here's a picture of a mountain pass mapped by Jim Bridger, known as Bridger's Pass. As a result of these expeditions, multiple trading posts would be established, such as Fort Williams, which would later be renamed Fort Laramie, and Fort Bridger, both of which were constructed in what is now Wyoming. And they would do this between the 1830s and 1840s CE. Then, in 1834 CE, white American Methodist missionary Jason Lee would migrate to the Pacific Northwest and would establish the Waskapom Mission. Shortly after this, in 1837 CE, white American Presbyterian missionaries Henry H. Spalding and Marcus Whitman would travel to the Pacific Northwest, where they would establish the Whitman Mission. The white American missionaries would seek to convert Native American nations, such as the Nez Perce Nation and the Paiute Nation, as they believed that conversion to Christianity must happen before the United States could fully colonize the Pacific Northwest. Then, between 1832 and 1834 CE, the United States would dispatch Captain Benjamin Bonneville to explore the North American Great Plains and the Pacific Northwest, and would dispatch Major John C. Fremont to explore the North American Great Plains and the Pacific Northwest between 1846 and 1848 CE. The Fremont expedition would go on to brutally massacre multiple peaceful Native American villages, which belonged to the Wintu Nation and the Klamath Nation. Now this brings us to our next section, the early colonization of the Pacific Northwest by white Americans. White Americans would begin calling for the annexation of the Pacific Northwest into the United States as part of the growing philosophy of manifest destiny, which was the belief that the United States should colonize all of North America. As part of this, small groups of white American families, such as the Bartleson Bidwell Party, would colonize the Pacific Northwest, bringing the white American population in the Pacific Northwest to several hundred individuals, with this happening between 1839 and 1842 CE. Then in 1843 CE, following routes previously established by British and American fur traders, Between 700 and 1,000 white Americans would migrate to and colonize the Pacific Northwest in what would become known as the Great Migration of 1843 CE. As a result of the Great Migration of 1843 CE, white Americans in the Willamette Valley of what is now Oregon would establish the Organic Laws of Oregon, granting married couples up to 640 acres of land and unmarried couples up to 320 acres of land. With these laws being established on July 5th, 1843 CE. Now, this brings us to our next section, the large-scale colonization of the Pacific Northwest and California by the United States. So, this large-scale colonization of California and the Pacific Northwest by the United States would officially begin when President James K. Polk would successfully negotiate with the British Empire to gain the section of the Pacific Northwest below the 49th parallel for the United States in the Oregon Treaty, which was signed on June 15th, 1846 CE. After the acquisition of the Pacific Northwest, roughly 400,000 primarily white American colonists would migrate west along what would become known as the Oregon Trail. However, it is important to note, despite its name, most of the colonists would travel to California, with this route being used between 1846 and 1869 CE. The travel west was often dangerous, as seen in the infamous Donner Party that became stranded in the Rocky Mountains during the winter after receiving false information about a shortcut across the Rocky Mountains. The party would famously resort to cannibalism to survive. However, what a lot of people aren't aware of is that this happened despite multiple attempts by Native American communities in the area to feed them. With Native American communities, the Native American communities often trying to bring them, like, for example, deer or rabbits that they had hunted and killed. However, the Donner Party would refuse to let them near the camp, often shooting at them with their rifles, and this was due to racism and fear. And all these events would happen between in the winter of 1846 and 1847 CE. Many white American settlers, upon reaching the Pacific Northwest, would begin to attack and massacre Native American villages. Most of these massacres were of either peaceful villages or villages of unarmed women and children, with many of these massacres happening between the 1840s and 1870s CE. Then, on August 14th, 1848 CE, the United States would officially reorganize the Pacific Northwest into the Oregon Territory. And then in 1849 CE, the United States Army would purchase trading posts such as Fort Williams, which would eventually be renamed Fort Laramie, and would convert them into military forts. These forts would become key places for American colonists to resupply and would become key staging points for attacking the Native American nations of the region. Uh, Thanks to the Oregon Trail, many cities such as San Francisco and Portland would grow in size thanks to the migration of American colonists along the Oregon Trail. Then, between 1844 and 1857 CE, fearing that African Americans would incite Native American nations to attack white American colonists, the Oregon Provisional Legislature, and then eventually Oregon's delegates to the state constitutional convention, would pass multiple laws preventing African Americans from entering Oregon. As a result, Oregon has only roughly 75 African American citizens by 1860 CE. Then, on September 9th, 1850 CE, California would be officially inducted into the United States as a state. Then the United States would pass the Donation Land Claim Act to promote the colonization of the Oregon Territory, with the act promising white American colonists who are married 320 acres of land and white American colonists who are unmarried 160 acres of land. The act would then go on to expire in 1854 CE, and land would go on to cost $1.25 per acre with a 320 acre limit. In other words, the amount of land that somebody could purchase was limited to 320 acres. And this act would be signed into law uh, on September 27th, 1850 CE, and would last for 4 years until 1854 CE. Then, on March 2nd, 1853 CE, the Washington Territory would be split from the Oregon Territory and would be created. Uh, Meanwhile, in the 1850s CE, Seattle, the leader of the Duwamish and Suquamish nations, and I do apologize if I butchered that, would go on to help many white American colonists, such as Doc Maynard, along the Duwamish River and its tributaries, providing them with safe transportation, and he would also help them clear forests for cultivation of crops and would provide labor in early sawmills and farms. As a result of this, Maynard and other white American colonists would found the city of Seattle, named in honor of Seattle himself, with the city being founded between 1853 and 1855 CE. Then, on January 22nd, 1855 CE, Seattle would be among the Native American leaders who would sign the Treaty of Point Elliott, which would cede roughly 2.5 million acres of land to the United States. This would anger many Duwamish who would renounce Seattle's leadership. Later, alongside many other Native American nations, the Duwamish would participate in the Yakima War against the United States. Then, on February 14th, 1859 CE, Oregon would become a state. And then in April of 1859 CE, the United States would dispatch Captain James H. Simpson and the United States Corps of Topographical Engineers to establish an army supply route across the Great Basin to the eastern slope of the Sierras. In the process, Simpson's expedition survey would survey and map the central overland route, a route through central Nevada, which was roughly 280 miles shorter than the standard Humboldt River California Trail route. While all this was happening, between 1843 and 1860 CE, ferries were being established along the Oregon Trail to help American colonists cross large rivers and even smaller streams. These ferries would decrease the travel time of the Oregon Trail from roughly 170 days to roughly 140 days. Then between 1859 and 1860 CE, the United States would improve the main routes of the Oregon Trail for use by wagons and stagecoaches, further decreasing the travel time of the Oregon Trail. Then between 1860 and 1861 CE, the Pony Express would be established to deliver mail across the Oregon Trail and other related routes, with the express being able to deliver mail from the Midwest to California in roughly 10 days, which would greatly increase the rate and distance of communication along the Oregon Trail and other related routes. Then, on October 24th, 1861 CE, the first transcontinental telegraph would be completed, which would even further increase the rate and distance of communication across the Oregon Trail and other related trails, and would also render the Pony Express obsolete. At its height, the Oregon Trail would witness a massive cattle industry as thousands of cattle would be herded to and from cities and towns along the Oregon Trail. This cattle industry would actually predate the Texas cattle industry, which would be first established or first seriously established in the 1860s. With this Oregon Trail cattle industry lasting between the 1840s and 1860s CE. Then in 1862 CE, a smallpox epidemic would ravage the Native American nations of the Pacific Northwest. Now this brings us to our next section, and a very important section of the video, the Mormon migration to the Pacific Northwest. After the assassination of their leader, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young would lead thousands of Mormons west to the Oregon Territory, where they would found Salt Lake City in what is now Utah, with the city being officially founded in 1847 CE. Roughly 43,000 Mormon colonists would go on to migrate to Utah between 1847 and 1860 CE. Uh, Once in Utah, Mormon colonists would instigate multiple massacres of Native American villages, such as the Provo River Massacre, where the Mormon militia, under orders from Brigham Young, would massacre between 40 to 100 members of the Timpanogo Nation. And again, I apologize if I butchered that. With 40 Timpanogo children, women, and a few men being taken as prisoners to nearby Fort Utah, where they would then be taken northward to the Salt Lake Valley and subsequently would be enslaved by church members. With this massacre and the subsequent enslavement happening between February 8th and 17th of 1850 CE. And here is a very racist caricature depiction of the prisoners at Fort Utah under the cannon platform of the fort. Then, between September 7th and September 11th, 1857 CE, a Mormon militia would launch an attack and massacre between 120 and 140 white American colonists who were part of the Baker Fancher wagon train bound for California and what would become known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. This massacre was a result of war hysteria about a possible invasion of Mormon territory and as a result of Mormon teachings against outsiders during what is known as the Mormon Reformation. The Mormons would then proceed to blame the massacre on local members of the Paiute Nation, despite there being no evidence of the Paiute Nation participating in the massacre, and Paiute oral history stating that they were very much not part of this massacre. It's also important to note that the Mormon Church, or the Church of Latter-day Saints, as they prefer to be called, would very much prefer this incident be swept under the rug and forgotten about. Now this brings us to our next section, the mass colonization of California by the United States. This would begin when famously gold would be discovered in California, which would result in the migration of roughly 120,000 primarily white American colonists to California in search of gold. And here is a depiction of one of those wagon trains going to California. During this travel, thousands of American colonists who were traveling to California would die of cholera, with most being buried in unmarked graves in Kansas and Nebraska, sometime in 1849 CE. Uh, During this migration, American colonists would often choose speed over safety, opting to use shortcuts such as the Sublet Greenwood Cutoff in Wyoming, which would reduce travel time by almost 7 days, but would span nearly 45 miles of desert that had no water, no grass to feed animals, and no fuel for fires. Upon arrival in California, many white American colonists would instigate massacres of Native American communities to steal their land for gold prospecting. These massacres would be encouraged and incentivized by the California government, with these massacres happening between 1849 and 1871 CE. As a result of the encroachment by California gold miners, multiple skirmishes would break out between the gold miners and the Native American communities of the Rogue River Valley between 1851 and 1855 CE. In response to the skirmishes in the Rogue River Valley, the United States Army and the Oregon militia would launch multiple attacks against the Native American communities of the Rogue River Valley. These attacks would result in the deaths of hundreds of Native Americans. One such battle, which occurred on October 31st, 1855 CE, resulted in near roughly 200 Native Americans being killed in this battle alone. With these campaigns and these attacks happening between October of 1855 to June 1855 CE of June to 1856 CE. Now this brings us to our next section, the major wars between the United States and the Native American nations of the Pacific Northwest. Starting with the weapons and warfare of the Native American nations of the Great Plains, Great Basin, and the Rocky Mountains. So, just for clarification, the Great Basin is a geographic region in the United States that extends from as far south as Mexico in the Sonoran Desert, and as far north as the south eastern part of Oregon. And then, obviously, uh, as everyone is aware, the Rocky Mountains are a mountain range that extend as far south as the northernmost part of New Mexico and as far north as the northeasternmost part, uh, or one of the northeasternmost parts of Alaska. And the Great Plains is a large geographic region that extends as far north as north central Canada and as far south as west in central Texas. Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at the warfare of the Native American peoples and nations of the Great Plains, Great Basin, and Rocky Mountains, uh, with which this warfare primarily consisted of mounted raiding with horses to acquire wealth and prestige. Often, men would take risks seeking glory and status. Horse stealing and revenge were common reasons for conducting a raid to take plunder, captives, and war trophies. The Native American nations of the Great Plains, Great Basin, and the Rocky Mountains were master horsemen and masters of mounted warfare. And here's some examples. Here are interior Salish, not to be confused with coastal Salish, which we'll look at in a minute. And here are some Nez Perce and Nez Perce warrior. A common custom of all the Native American nations of the Great Plains, Great Basin, and Rocky Mountains was the act of counting coup, in which the object was simply to touch an enemy in battle without hurting them. A special coup stick was sometimes used for this purpose, although a war club, a lance, a bow, or even the hand itself would do. An eagle feather would then be awarded to the warrior for each coup that was counted. After counting coup on an armed enemy, if a warrior managed to kill the enemy, then scalp him, the warrior would receive three coup feathers. After capturing the enemy's possessions, especially eagle feathers, capturing the enemy's possessions, especially eagle feathers, would bring great honor. And here's an example of some of what coup feathers would look like. There's some variation to that, but you can see that here. And then here's another variation of that here. The weapons used by the Native American nations of the Great Basin, Great Plains, and the Rocky Mountains included, but were not limited to, war clubs that were sort of ovate in shape and stone like this, or gun stock war clubs, named that because they roughly look like the stock of a gun, which were could either be used as blunt instruments or would oftentimes have stone or steel or iron spikes attached to them. And then, most famously, they would wield pipe tomahawks, though it is important to note tomahawks are a subset of the weapon type known as the war club. They would also use trade knives, steel knives that they had traded uh, with American and British and French, etc., fur traders. And then for long range, for horseback warfare, they would use war lances, like this one you see here, much like very similar to, say, the lance of a European knight. And then for long range, warfare. They would use, of course, bows and arrows, but with the contact with Europeans and the United States by proxy, they would eventually begin using rifles such as this percussion cap rifle you see here, and then eventually they would begin using more advanced and more modern Winchester rifles. And then for armor, they would use things like bone bead breastplates and elk or buffalo hide or deer hide, etc., buckskin shields. Now it is time to look at the warfare and the weapons of the Native American nations of the Pacific Coast, because obviously the weapons and warfare of the Native American nations of the Pacific Coast were very much different from those of the Native American nations of the Great Plains, Great Basin, and Rocky Mountains. So, with that in mind, uh, generally warfare on the Pacific coast and the adjacent rivers primarily consisted of large and small scale raids using canoes and other sea craft to obtain wealth, which came in the form of things such as pelts valued for trade goods, such as beavers and otter pelts. Oftentimes, they would raid to obtain iron or steel tools and guns, and would also raid to obtain enslaved people who would go create and maintain the means of living for the upper class. And here's some examples of warriors of the Pacific Coast. Um, it is important to note that the northern warriors, such as the Haida and the Tlingit warriors, were a little too far north for the United States Army. They did face the United States Navy, however, and also the Canadian Army. However, they were also not part of the Oregon or Washington territories. But it is important to point out what they look like because they were part of the Pacific Northwest. More generally, the type of warriors that the United States Army would combat along the Pacific coast in the Oregon and Washington territories would look something like the warriors seen uh, here, here, and here. The weapons used by the Native Americans of the Pacific coast included carved wooden war sticks, war clubs that you can see here and here, stone war clubs seen here, and even wooden war clubs that had things such as orca teeth embedded. This is actually a Haida war club with orca teeth embedded into it. So again, this comes from a Native American nation that's not actually was not actually in the territory of the United States, or at least not at the time. But regardless, this is something very similar to this would have been used by the other Native American nations of the Pacific coast of Oregon and the Washington Territory. They would also use steel and iron knives, some of them being double bladed, seen here for hand to hand combat, and others looking something generally like this. They would also use for mid-range, long-range combat harpoons that were traditionally used for fishing and whaling and other marine activities. With these harpoons coming in a variety of shapes, lengths, and sizes, and having a variety of points. Some having one, some having two, etc., etc. And then for long range combat, the Native American nations of the Pacific Coast would, of course, use the bow and arrow. And then, like the Native American nations of the Great Plains, Great Basin, and Rocky Mountains, upon contact with European powers such as the British Empire and the United States, would first begin using guns such as this percussion cap rifle seen here, and then would eventually use more modern rifles, such as this Winchester rifle seen here. And then the Native American nations of the Pacific coast would use various types of um, uh, tanned hide armor, called clammin, such as this elk hide armor used by the Chinookan peoples and Chinookan warriors here. Here are some examples of tlingit hide armors here. Here are some more examples of Tlingit and Haida armors. And yes, these are indeed coins attached to this elk leather armor. These were Chinese coins that were either brought and traded to the Haida and Tlingit via the Canton trade network, where European nations such as the British Empire and the United States would sail to Imperial China to trade for things like tea and opium, and would get coins like this. Or sometimes they would obtain these coins via shipwrecks, Chinese shipwrecks that would wash ashore. And then here's some more example of some typical Pacific Northwest armor used by Pacific Northwest warriors. And here's some more examples of that. And another type of armor that was used, albeit less frequently than, say, elk hide armor, would be corded rope armor, which you can see here worn by this warrior here. All right, now we need to look at the United States soldiers and weapons and the warfare that they practiced, specifically between the 1840s and 1850s CE. So, during this period between the 1840s and 1850s CE, the United States would practice warfare that initially consisted of infantry units that would attack enemy forces using line battle formations, where they stand in line, each with a musket side by side and would all fire at once, with cavalry being used for small scale skirmishes and scouting. However, as the United States would begin expanding into the Great Plains and the Great Basin, the United States cavalry, and also the Rocky Mountains, the United States cavalry would gradually transition into a mobile strike force used for paramilitary campaigns against Native American nations. And you can see an example of that transition here and here. And this would be typical of what United States cavalry looked like at that time, and is generally what we tend to see in modern Western movies. And the type of weapons that the United States Army would use would include things such as the 1842 CE model percussion pistol and the Colt model 1847 CE revolver. And then initially percussion cap rifles seen here. Uh, then eventually shortly followed by uh, slightly more modern Spencer repeating rifles, and then eventually replaced by even more modern Winchester rifles. And then for close quarters combat, the United States Army would use weapons such as the Model 1832 CE foot artillery sword, and of course the very famous Bowie knife. And then cavalry, as well as officers, would use the Model 1840 CE light artillery saber. All right, now this brings us to the first war between the United States and the Native American nations of the Pacific Northwest, the Cayuse War. So, the Cayuse War would begin on November 29th, 1847 CE, when a combination of tensions from conversion attempts, land disputes, the forcing of Native American nations to work on white American farms before they were given food as relief for harsh winters, and the belief that white American missionaries were trying to poison them with tainted meat would lead to the massacre of the Whitmans at the hands of Cayuse warriors and what would become known as the Whitman Massacre. In response to the Whitman Massacre, the Provisional Legislature of Oregon would dispatch the militia unit known as the Oregon Rifles to retaliate against the Cayuse on December 8th, 1847 CE. The Oregon Rifles would march to the Dallas Mission, defeat a small group of Cayuse warriors, and would build Fort Lee, which was named for the commander of the militia, Henry A.G. Lee, with these events happening between December 21st, 1847 CE to January 1st, 18 sorry, to January 1848 CE. Then, also in January 1848 CE, a force of 500 militiamen would march against the Cayuse and other Native American nations of the Central Oregon Territory, with the Oregon militia later being reinforced by the United States Army. While some Cayuse would attempt to negotiate peace agreements with the Oregon militia, the United States, others would resist, but would be unable to mount an effective opposition to the Oregon militia and the United States. These Cayuse communities would then go into hiding in the Blue Mountains of what is now Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Then on June 3rd, 1850 CE, the Cayuse Nation would hand over five individuals, and I'm sure I will butcher this and I apologize, including Tilukikit and Tamahas, to be tried for the murder of the Whitmans. These individuals would become known as the Cayuse Five, with all five being tried by a military tribunal and hanged. Now, that being said, one of the defendants, Kimasapunkin, would claim innocence in his final statement, which I will read here, with the final statement of Kimasapunkin reading, quote, I was up the river at the time of the massacre, and I did not arrive until the next day. I was riding on horseback. A white woman came running from the house. She held out her hands and told me not to kill her. I put my hand on her head and told her not to be afraid. There were plenty of Native Americans all about. She, with the other women and children, went to Walla Walla to Mr. Ogden's. I was not present at the murder, nor was I concerned in it. I am innocent. It hurts me to talk about dying for nothing. Our chief told me to come down and tell all about it. Those who committed the murder are killed and dead. The priests say I must die tomorrow. If they kill me, I am innocent. My young chief told me I was to come here to tell what I know concerning the murders. I did not come as one of the murderers, for I am innocent. I never made any declaration to anyone that I was guilty. This is the last time that I may speak. So, as you can see, he very much adamantly claimed he was innocent. Kimasapunkin very much adamantly claimed he was innocent to his dying breath. And here's the source that I got this excerpt from. Uh, However, it's important to note the execution of the Cayuse Five did not end the Cayuse War, as sporadic skirmishes would continue for 5 years until the Oregon militia and the United States would defeat the Cayuse Nation. The United States would then force the Cayuse Nation to cede most of its territory and would forcibly move the Cayuse Nation to a reservation with the Umatilla Nation and the Walla Walla Nation. All three would then become the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and the population of all three would decrease dramatically as a result of the campaign by the Oregon Militia and the United States Army, with this happening in 1855 CE. Now this brings us to the next war, the Yakima War. So, on September 20th, 1855 CE, white American miners in the Washington Territory would attack and kill two Yakima women and an infant. In response, Yakima warriors would attack and kill the miners, along with Bureau of Indian Affairs agent Andrew Boland, seen here. In response to the deaths of Boland and the miners, the United States would dispatch United States Major Granville O'Haller, who would launch an attack on the Yakima but would be quickly defeated in the Battle of Toppenish Creek. This would officially ignite what would become known as the Yakima War on October 5th, 1855 CE. The United States would be defeated by the Yakima Nation in the Battle of White River, but would also defeat the Yakima Nation at the Battle of Union Gap, both of these battles happening in November of 1855 CE. Sporadic skirmishes between the Yakima warriors and the United States Dragoons would continue with neither side gaining the advantage, with these skirmishes happening between 1855, November 1855, and January 1856 CE. Then, in November of 1855 CE, United States General John E. Wool would arrive from California and would take command of the United States Army in the Washington Territory, making Fort Vancouver his headquarters. On January 26, 1856 CE, the United States Army would go on to defeat the Yakima Nation in the Battle of Seattle. Then, in March of 1856 CE, Yakima warriors led by the Yakima leader, or a Yakima leader, Leshy, uh, would be successfully raided by warriors of the Snoqualmie Nation, led by Snoqualmie leader uh, Potkanem, who had formed an alliance with the United States Army. Potkanem would attempt to capture Leshy, but Leshy was able to escape the raid. Then, in spring of 1856 CE, suspecting that some white American colonists in Pierce County who had married into the Yakima Nation were conspiring with the Yakima Nation against the United States, Washington Governor Isaac Stevens would order the Pierce County colonists to be arrested. This order would be contradicted by a county judge who would release the colonists. In response, Stevens would declare martial law in Pierce County and Thurston County, and would order the arrest of the judge by the Washington militia. However, the militia would be stopped by the Chief Justice of the Territorial Supreme Court and by a posse led by the Pierce County Sheriff. As a result of this, Stevens would concede to the release of the prisoners and would end martial law in Pierce County and Thurston County. Then, between March 26th and March 27th, 1856 CE, warriors from the Yakima Nation, the Klickitat Nation, and the Wasco Wishram Nation would attack and defeat the United States, attack and defeat United States soldiers and white American colonists at the Cascade Rapids. This event would become known as the Cascade Massacre. In response, the United States would send reinforcements to defend against further attacks. As a result of these reinforcements, 9 Wasco Wishram warriors, including Wasco Wishram leader Chenoweth, would surrender without a fight. However, despite their surrender, the captured warriors would be charged for treason and executed. Then, in September 1856 CE, Isaac Stevens would negotiate an end to the Yakima War at Fort Walla Walla, and in November 1856 CE, Leshy would be captured and tried for the murders of white American colonists, including Abram Benton Moses, and also for his role in the Yakima War. However, his first trial would result in a hung jury, and after this, Leshy would then be retried and would eventually be hanged for murder. This would happen despite vague witness accounts and issues over whether or not Leshy was actually present at Moses's murder, with his official hanging and execution happening on February 19th, 1858 CE. However, despite the temporary end to the Yakima War, continued encroachment on their homelands by white American colonists and miners would lead the Yakima Nation, the Skitswish Nation, the Kalispel Nation, the Spokane Nation, the Palouse Nation, and the northern branch of the Paiute Nation to gather a combined force of 1,000 warriors. This allied force would then attack and defeat the United States Army at the Battle of Pine Creek, also known as the Steptoe Disaster, named for the commander of this group of United States soldiers, Lieutenant Colonel E.J. Steptoe. This would reignite the Yakima War on May 17th, 1858 CE. In response to the Battle of Pine Creek, the United States Army would dispatch a force of 500 United States soldiers and 200 volunteers. And actually, these volunteers were drovers or cowboys who had volunteered. And the United States soldiers and volunteers would go on to defeat the Allied Native American force at the Battle of Four Lakes and the Battle of Spokane Plains between September 1st and September 5th, 1858 CE. Realizing that they were unable to defeat the United States, the Allied Native American forces would negotiate a peace treaty. In return for a cessation of the attacks by the United States Army, the Allied Native Americans would surrender the leaders responsible for the Battle of Pine Creek, including Yakima leader Qualchun, all of whom would then be hanged. The Yakima and their allies would then be forced to cede most of their homelands to the United States and would be moved to reservations, with this officially ending the Yakima War in September of 1858 CE. Now this brings us to the last war that we're going to look at, the Snake War, which is named for the Native American nations who live along the Snake River. As they would migrate to California and the Oregon Territory, white American colonists would overharvest the food resources traditionally relied upon by Native American nations living along the Snake River, such as the Shoshone Nation and the Paiute Nation. This would result in repeated famines within the Native American nations of the region, with these events happening between 1847 and 1862 CE. And here is a map of the Snake River. As a result of these famines and continued encroachment by white American colonists, the Shoshone Nation, the Paiute Nation, and other Native American nations would begin to sporadically raid and kill white American colonists between 1847 and the 1860s CE. After the son of a Shoshone leader was killed for horse theft, despite a white English immigrant attesting to the man's innocence, the Shoshone would then attack and kill white American colonists near Fort Hall in the summer of 1859 CE, and would attack and kill the white American colonists in the Utter Party in what would become known as the Utter Party Massacre on September 9th, 1860 CE. In response to the Shoshone raids, the United States would dispatch Colonel Patrick Edward Connor, who would lead 200 California state volunteers to attack and massacre a village of roughly 250 to 400 Shoshone women and children in what would become known as the Bear River Massacre on January 29th, 1863 CE. In response to the Bear River Massacre, warfare between the United States and Native American nations such as the Shoshone Nation and Paiute Nation would increase along the Snake River, with this warfare consisting of sporadic raids and this conflict spreading across California, Utah, Nevada, Oregon, and Idaho. The conflict would become known as the Snake War. Um, with all of these battles happening between 1864 and 1868 CE. And you can see the scope of the Snake War on these maps here and here. Colonel George Crook would then attack and defeat a band of Paiute warriors led by Paiute leader Howluck in the Battle of Owyhee River in 1866 CE. The Snake War would end when Colonel Crook negotiated a peace treaty with Paiute leader Waiowawa. And actually, the Snake War is still the deadliest war between the Native American nations of the Great Plains and the United States, with the total casualty count being 1,762 men killed, wounded, or captured during the conflict, with the Snake War officially ending in 1868 CE. Now, this brings us to our next section, the decline of the Oregon Trail. So, traffic along the Oregon Trail would begin to decrease as American colonists would increasingly rely on paddle-wheeled steamships and sailing ships, as well as the Panama Railroad that had been constructed across the Isthmus of Panama in 1855 CE, all of which would provide faster transportation to California and Oregon than overland travel, with this happening in the 1850s CE. Then traffic along the Oregon Trail would further decrease with the outbreak of the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865 CE. And the Oregon Trail would then be mostly abandoned with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which would provide faster, safer, and usually cheaper travel east and west. With the Transcontinental Railroad being officially completed in 1869 CE. Now this brings us to our last section, the aftermath of the Oregon Trail and the colonization of California and the Pacific Northwest by the United States. So, the longest lasting consequences and aftermath of the colonization of California and the Pacific Northwest by the United States, thanks to the Oregon Trail, would be that the Native American nations of California, the Great Plains, and the Pacific Northwest would fall prey to genocide at the hands of the United States between 1849 CE and the early 19, really arguably to this day, but still the early 1900s CE. And actually, I should say definitely to this day, the genocide is still happening. And here's the Native American nations and cultures of California, the Great Plains, and the Pacific Northwest. Then another result of the Oregon Trail is that the Oregon Trail would serve as the model for the later colonization of Wyoming and Montana by white Americans through the use of the Bozeman Trail, which would be utilized between 1863 and 1868 CE. And uh, obviously, the one of the most obvious consequences and aftermath of the Oregon Trail and the colonization of the Pacific Northwest and California by the United States would be that the United States now, to this day, stretches from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. All right, with that, that ends this video on the Oregon Trail and the colonization of California and the Pacific Northwest by the United States. Uh, as with the previous videos in the series, I really hope that I hope that you enjoyed the parts of this video where you learned about the culture of the Native American peoples of California and the Pacific Northwest. Um, but I also really hope that you did not enjoy the parts involving the massacres and genocide and forcible removal of the Native American peoples of California and the Pacific Northwest. And I know, as I've said with the previous videos, that it's odd for I, the person making this video, to say. However, in many ways, I'm making these videos not necessarily for your entertainment, but for your education, because these are events that should never have happened. And the only way we can prevent them from continuing to happen and prevent them from ever happening again is by bringing these events to light, uh, is by educating you, the viewers, on these subjects. So, with that in mind, that ends our video. Thank you for watching, and if you would like me to cover any of the subjects I discussed in the video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section, and remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you all have a good day.